Well, this book arose out of an experience that I'll never forget. I was giving expert testimony in a state administrative tribunal case which was playing out in Perth. I was doing it online by Skype. And on one side there was the Hordijk family, Byron and Kira Hordijk, from a Dutch Reformed church. On the other side there was Wansley Family Services, who'd rejected the Hordijks' application as foster parents for young children, and they rejected them because of their views about homosexuality. This made them unsuitable to foster infants, they said. And this was a rejection based on their religious beliefs. So the Hordijks were defending their case by saying they'd been discriminated against based on their religion, and Wansley Family Services was saying, we've got lots of Christians who are fostering and they don't have any problem signing our documents and agreeing, so it can't be their Christian faith that's the reason. The Hordijks were defended by the Human Rights Law Alliance, which is a fantastic organisation, and its mission, its vision is to defend Christians in generationally significant cases around Australia. There are dozens of cases of Christians around Australia who are discriminated against in study, in the workplace, in other ways, and the Human Rights Law Alliance takes up their cause if they feel that the case is significant, that it will make a big difference in the way that the law develops. And so they defended the Hordijks in this case. And they ended up winning the case in the end. The Christians won that case. The case was heard by Justice Janine Pritchard. She's the president of the Administrative Tribunal in Perth and also a judge of the Supreme Court of Western Australia. So they brought in a very qualified judge to deal with the issue. Appearing for Wansley Family Services was Penelope Giles. She was examining or cross-examining me. She was the senior counsel, a lawyer with almost 40 years of experience in law and a glittering career. And I'd been asked by John Steenhoff of the Human Rights Law Alliance to prepare expert testimony. He asked me to explain what Christianity was, what a church is like, what are their views, how does it all work about sexuality in the churches. So I did my paper, I presented it, and the lawyer for the Wansley Services, Penelope Giles, then examined me and my testimony. Now, I'd reported about the National Church Life Survey, which has very interesting information about what Christians who go to church think about human sexuality. And as she was asking me these questions, she said, well, why have you only got data from churches? Why doesn't the National Church Life Survey produce responses from synagogues and from mosques and from temples? And I said, well, they're not churches. You know, this is a National Church Life Survey, and it's a survey of churches. She was quite puzzled by this. She had a lot of trouble understanding that a National Church Life Survey wouldn't be surveying synagogues or temples. She was also incredulous about my testimony. My testimony was, in essence, that churches with progressive and more liberal views on human sexuality are declining and dying, while those with more conservative views and parts of churches that are more conservative are the ones that are growing. And it was just like she could not process this. And she would try a question, another question, and you could just tell she just couldn't get it. And in the end, the judge intervened and said, oh, Dr. Durie, isn't it the case that this is what you're saying and this is the evidence that you've produced? And I said, with relief, yes. That's exactly right. Thank you, Judge. That really struck me, that experience. And what really struck me is that Ms. Giles couldn't understand a fundamental fact about Australian Christianity, that declining churches often have a more secular understanding of what it means to be a human being. She was completely on the opposite of reality about how churches work and how they're developing. For example, the Uniting Church is the fastest declining major denomination in Australia. It's also the most liberal. It's embraced same-sex marriage. The Uniting Church Code of Conduct doesn't regard adultery as a code of conduct violation. That's happened now in a few Anglican dioceses as well. They've gone in that direction. Young people are staying away in droves from the Uniting Church. In contrast, the Pentecostal churches, which uphold biblical sexual ethics, are full of young people. the barrister just couldn't comprehend that. And in a way, having that experience, a surreal experience with someone who was obviously intelligent, had spent decades and decades working through legal cases, was aware of the world, you would think, and society. It was just completely blocked about fundamental realities, about churches and about theology and what is Christianity. I was stunned at the extent of religious illiteracy in what you might have assumed would be an intelligent person. And this can't be good for Christians. It can't be good when clever, able people completely misunderstand Christianity and don't know what it is and how it works. Extreme ignorance like that provides a context in which prejudice and all sorts of potentially hostile views can slip in and fill the vacuum created by the ignorance. So I wrote Double-Minded in part to deal with this knowledge gap, to write a book that maybe a lawyer or a politician or someone in a policy-making role could read in order to understand Christianity. I had some other agendas running through the book. One is to encourage Christians. Some Christians, like Nicky Gemmell, as we just heard before, Gordon said, are saying that the reason why churches are struggling or declining is because they're not getting with the culture, because they're on the wrong side of public opinion, they're on the wrong side of history. And it's because they're not accepting the sexual revolution that they're dying. And we have voices here in Melbourne Anglican Church who've argued that over the years as well. But these voices are just completely wrong. This is not the case. It's not true. And it's important to encourage Christians that if you uphold biblical ethics, you actually are on the right side of church history. That is the future of the church. Another agenda in writing the book is to help Christians understand what is at stake, because it's not just about what do I think about people having sex with other people of the same gender. That's actually not what these fundamental issues are about. The deeper issue I suggested is that this is not about sex as such, it's about how we see ourselves as human beings. And that is probably something as fundamental as that is perhaps something worth dividing over. Because how we see ourselves as individuals, as human beings, is also grounded in how we see God. It's actually a fundamental theological issue. What are we all here for on this earth? The Bible offers one answer, which has guided Western cultures for centuries. That is, that we're here in order to glorify God, in order to know God, in order to serve God, and to fulfill the destiny that He's intended for us. But contemporary secular morality offers a completely different understanding. And the point that's become dominant in our culture, the point of being human, is to basically realize ourselves, that you should do you. And there are lots of terms in our language that reflect this, like fulfillment, authenticity, identity, agency. When someone says, oh, we have to protect people's agency, they're using a term from a toolkit that is built around the idea that we are self-realizing individuals, and that's the whole point of being human. This goes very deep into us. It's become part of the air we breathe. It's become the normal way of thinking. And I really want to encourage Christians to critique their culture and think about how they use language, terms like identity, and use language in ways that reflect biblical truth and not just be driven along by the winds of culture. I also wanted to write this book to help Christians understand that, in a real sense, sex is dividing churches. That is, there are divisions opening up. And there's actually no Band-Aid big enough to hold that together. It's a bit like if you're having a huge crack appearing in your wall, you can't fix it by putting wallpaper over it, because in a year or two, the wallpaper will split as well and the structural damage will continue. And I had encountered over the years quite a few Christians with a heads in the sands approach, like, oh, that's kind of awkward, but let's not talk about it. Hopefully it'll all work out in the end. Let's not engage with this issue. It's a sort of close your eyes and hope for the best approach, which unfortunately has been dominant in many denominations. It's as if, you know, we're not sure what the future holds, but we don't want to think about it. But that won't work. Because at some point along the line, you'll be asked to make a choice. Are you going to agree to this code of conduct? Are you going to agree to this teaching? Is that consistent with your faith? You need to make a stand at some point. And this won't just be happening on this issue, it's happening in many areas in our culture and in our society. And that's why the Human Rights Law Alliance keeps having to defend Christians who are facing legal issues in our cultures just because they're Christians. So the momentum of this parting of ways, I think, is unstoppable. The reasons that are driving it are very deep. Papering over the divergence is not going to fix it. So I think we should actually be preparing for the division. And in a way, for me, writing the book was part of that, my preparation, understanding why it's happening, how the divisions will play out, the role that church polity plays, the role that differences between different churches are working out as well. I really love the church. I gave up an academic career to be a pastor. Some of my friends thought I was crazy. I wasn't realising myself, or perhaps they thought I was, but not in the way that they would have realised themselves. I love the church, and I consider that I'm bound to work for its unity. It's like every Christian should seek for the church to be one. Jesus told us that and taught us that. But we're entering into an era where the dominant secular culture is increasingly hostile to biblical Christianity. It's been building for centuries, goes back 300 years. It's not something new. And Christians mustn't sleepwalk their way into this crisis. We need to be wide awake, alert and engaged. We need to address issues with our young people, with our churches, with our communities, before they get forced upon us by the state or by the country, by the society around us. We need to form vibrant fellowships of biblical faith, even though they might be small, but which are transformational and are changing people's lives and changing them to be more like Jesus and to grow into the full knowledge of Jesus Christ. This will require a walk apart. It is, as Gordon said, somewhat like how things were in the early church. It's like we're doing history backwards. We're retreating from Christendom and back into the first few Christian centuries. The Apostle Peter wrote about this dynamic of living in a world that you don't quite belong in. In 1 Peter, he said, we're strangers, foreigners, temporary residents in this world. We like to think of ourselves as citizens, as fully paid up, signed up, we've got our rights, we're Aussies, this is our place. But Peter said, no, that's actually not the way it is. We're just temporary here. This is not our final destination. It's not our full destiny. He says, live out your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you by your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but it was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, so your faith and hope are in God. Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for each other, love one another deeply from the heart. So he's describing there an antidote to the pressure of living in alien territory. And the antidote is to know with all your heart that you've been called by Christ to follow his way of life, not the empty way of life that's been handed down by our ancestors or invented in the last couple of decades in our universities or in our policy-making departments in government. We're not here for that empty way of life. And he also says, actually, we need to keep remembering that we're called to purify ourselves, to walk in truth, to be set free. That's what we're called to. And partly that means holding lightly to this world, of being able to step back and say, yes, this is the way things are, but that's not who I've been called to be. That's not my identity. This is not my home. This world is not our home. We've been redeemed, Peter says, from the empty way of life that's been handed, in this case by the ancestors, now by our culture. We've been redeemed from that, and it is an empty way of life. And I say that without in any way denying the beauty and the wonder of life and human creation and many wonderful things, but our home lies somewhere else. Those who follow Christ, I think, are called to form vibrant communities of faith, deeply grounded in our identity as redeemed people, purified by the truth, living in love for one another. We're not here on this earth to realize ourselves. Jesus, when he was being led to the cross, he didn't for a moment think, oh, I should be realizing myself. Should be doing me. Well, he was. He was doing what he was asked of, what his Father asked of him. He was going to the cross in obedience. And he revealed God to us in that. We find our true freedom in actually following Jesus, not in following our own way. So I hope my little book will help at least some of us to be bold, clearer, more confident in living out the life that Christ has called us to. Not marching to the beat of an alien culture's drum, not even in our sleep doing that, but living with our eyes fixed on the glorious life of the Son of God. My prayer is that we'd be people of truth and love and passionate about both truth and love in this context. So I hope the book will help the secular lawyers and the politicians and others that might desire to understand the church better, to recognise maybe they need help to do that. But I also hope it'll encourage the church to hold its ground in the face of the pressures we face and not to be lost and confused just because all these voices are coming against us and we're being squeezed into the mould that the world has provided for us. So thank you once again for coming tonight. I think, Pastor Jeremy, was there a plan to have some Q&A? Open it up for questions. I'm very happy to field questions, responses. I love questions. Quiet range. Jeremy.
For those of us from churches that do not have a clear cut, there's a place in the book about the exclusive Brethren Church. There's another case where they defended their rejection of an LGBT group hiring their campsite. And then they have no defined sort of tenets of belief because they said, we just believe the Bible. And I read that, I realized it's important for us, those churches who are more recent or do not have established traditions, to articulate the points of your beliefs. You know, I think our church have 15 points. Some churches have 10 points. At least you believe. You cannot say, I believe the whole Bible. When you go to the law court, no one will read the whole Bible for you. You know, so it's also important. I think that point. I find it resonate with me.
Yeah, and just a comment about that. So discrimination is illegal, but there are exemptions. And one of the exemptions that's common is that if people are acting in accordance with the tenets or the teachings of their religion, then they're protected. So if you're teaching, what's in the Bible, then there's, in principle, protection against anti-discrimination law. The problem arises when your denomination doesn't have tenets, when there is no formal statement of theology. So if the Catholic Church had to defend its theology of sexuality, it would have its 900-page catechism to explain it in great detail. The Anglican Church would be in more trouble because if one bishop said, oh, this is what we believe, another bishop might say something else, and there's actually very little in our founding documents about sexual ethics. I think the most it says is follow the 10 Commandments. And inconsistency within a denomination will make them vulnerable to legal cases. So that's another kind of warning in that the brethren were caught out because they don't even have things as theological colleges, as I understand, or theologians. Every church has its own leadership, which raises up within it, and that made them incredibly vulnerable. So they ended up being the victim of a Uniting Church theologian who was the expert that the judge accepted evidence from, and he said, of course, Christianity is this, and it's this, and it's this. And so the judge says, well, that's what Christianity is, so that's what the brethren are under, which is completely contrary to what they believed. Actually, religious freedom laws should protect individual conscience, but in Australia, these sorts of laws only protect religions. And that's a problem with our religious freedom environment in Australia. But it means that, so what we did at Oak Tree was early on, we got a code of conduct and we wrote down, and I said, we require these beliefs or practices based on the resolutions of the Lambeth Conference. And so this is our stated view. I don't care what the church down the road is doing they might have a completely different approach, but this is our approach, and it's open and everyone knows, and we could defend that if we were taken to court. But churches that haven't thought that through are not ready for that. The other problem that the Brethren campsite had is they just were not ready. They had no clue this was coming down the road. Although it obviously was, you know, it was going to happen at some time, but they just were not ready for it at all. And that's something that churches can't afford these days. There's at least one denomination, which I mentioned in the book, the Apostolic, used to be called Apostolic Church, now it's called Global Acts Ministry, a Pentecostal church. They added their view on marriage to their page-long theological, doctrinal statements, just for this reason, so they could say, well, actually we do have a position on this, but churches will have to take a stand. They won't be able to be vague, and that will become more and more apparent as time passes. That clarity is needed. You might think being vague is good, like it allows a lot of different people to coexist, but the reality is if you're vague and someone's defending their right to have a view that's not in agreement with the culture, the church will not be able to stand up for them because they don't stand for anything. And that's a big problem. You know, if, for example, if a bishop is accepting someone who has an adulterous relationship or is in a same-sex relationship, even though that's against the code of conduct of the diocese, then another church that insists on those standards will have trouble defending their views in court because the other side will say, well, look, the bishop accepts it here, so why is it a problem for you? Which is just what the Wansley Family Services was doing with this couple. We are not ready. We're not ready for the full force of this. A question up the back. Certain professions have ethics.
Their own ethics, and they have their own code of conduct. But if you are a Christian in that profession, and you have your own conscience, how do you defend yourself in that kind of situation?
Well, that's difficult, and that's why in the UK some doctors have been kicked out, you know, disbarred from practice because they've expressed a view that the medical organisation's been unhappy with. Yeah. And this is the very reason why the Human Rights Law Alliance exists, to defend people's freedoms. It's difficult, and the climate is getting harder.
Yeah, because there is a few doctors that has been kicked out in Australia when they express their own religious conscience opinion, whether in social media or in their own writings or in their actions or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. So the churches should be ready to stand with them and stand up behind them, and they should be able to say, I've said this, but this is actually what my church teaches. You know, it's clear that I'm part of a movement that holds this view, but at present it can be very difficult for them to do that, depending on their church background. Yeah.
Since the mic is here. Now, what would you advise the church when, let's say, they plan their preaching program? I noticed that our churches are a little bit shying away in the pulpit to actually even talk about, many ways I'm talking my church too, talk about the current issue of this, what do you call, of sex and identity and all that kind of thing. And then especially when now we have our, most of our sermon being broadcast and to you know, it's quite easily to get online and recorded.
Well,
so how do you think that, I mean, what are the safeguards or what are the challenges you think we should actually approach this subject?
Well, with Andrew Thurgood, someone went and listened to sermons from the church from years past to attack his presidency at Essendon Football Club. Yeah, I think pastors should speak about these issues, and the more the better, and just explain this is what we believe, this is what we teach, love people, welcome them by all means, but just be completely clear. Put it on your website. This is what we expect of our workers. These are our policy documents. You won't be able to get around this by just pretending otherwise or concealing it. If you're concerned that you might attract unwanted legal attention, then maybe you shouldn't put the sermon up on the internet, but the problem with that is that you end up just suppressing who you are, and it creates problems for others who are speaking out. the more heads above the parapet, the better. If 99 pastors won't speak and one speaks up, that one person's in trouble. But if 100 people speak up, they're much safer. So, people need to realise they have a responsibility, not just for their own peace of mind and to avoid conflicts with their members, but they have responsibility to the whole church as well. And partly it's about finding language to express these truths in ways that are loving and gracious and biblical. So that's, I think, some pastors, they just don't know what to do or how to do it. So I hope the book will help that in a way. Excuse me. Oh, that feels better. I hope I didn't lose too many brains. Yes, Gordon.
The basic tendency for state bodies to kind of overreach on various issues, like let's say Christian schools, and who are the people who can be. There can be discrimination in favour of someone who is a chaplain at the Christian school, but not the science teacher or the secretary or the people who, like in the Northern Territory, when I spoke to the Christian schools up there, their gardeners were part of the conference talking about the Garden of Eden and ecological issues from a Christian perspective and all that sort of stuff, And so they're the ones who can define things, usually in very privatised kinds of ways that are very reductive.
That's been coming for 20 years.
Yeah,
that is, that a job can only discriminate if it's part of the necessary requirements of the job. It was taken out of disability law and it's been applied to religion.
Mm-hmm.
And that means you can't choose a Christian maths teacher, for example, because it's not part of the necessary requirements. I mean, I had a few strategies in the parish. So basically every single staff member was part of the pastoral community and they all had to lead devotions from time to time, and so there was no kind of, these are the religious ones and these are the secular ones. So there's things you can do locally to protect yourself from that.
Yeah.
But that's a long push. I mean, that's, to be really frank, that push is a desire to push religion out of schooling. It's a desire to push the church back into a very small box.
Yeah.
And it's an assault on the right of association, the right of people to gather together for a particular purpose. It's ironic because politicians have the right to refuse to employ someone from another party in their office. And it's not part of the necessary requirements of the job. They don't have to worry about that. They just say, I'm a Liberal politician, I don't want to employ someone from the Greens. But a Christian is not allowed to say, well, I don't really want a gardener who's a Satanist or, a receptionist who's a Satanist. That apparently is unacceptable, but so yes, it's hypocrisy. And part of the problem is not only the antagonism against the church, but also ignorance about how Christianity works and how identity works. Yeah, these are really serious issues.
If I just ask or mention another one that's related is
Yes.
land tax. So land tax, and I'm locoming at an Anglican parish, and we had a ballet group there. They were there for 13 years. What we found out, we have a newly retired lawyer in the parish, which is a very handy thing to have. And even the advice of the diocese is wrong about this. And there are lots of churches that are frankly, they're going to get blasted out of the water in terms of their the amount of tax they're going to have to pay. Because they still think they can kind of rent to various groups out there, or someone wants a party or other things like this. And there are formulations of the amount of land that is used, etc., etc. And so we've had to say quite sadly to this lady that she needs to find another place, at least until sometime.
Because otherwise you'll be taxed as if it was you were a commercial business and paying
and
full
so
land
there's no
tax.
kind of understanding about rights of association is very good, and the way that and rights of community and how we operate. Fortunately, the very good play group that we have is all in the name of the church.
So it's a religious activity.
Yeah, so it's counted as a religious activity, but you've really got to go through and really look carefully at. We've had to take off for hire. The hall is for hire, for instance.
I mean,
sorts of things.
that's a good example of where you need a group like the Human Rights Law Alliance to take up those cases and say, is that legal what they're doing? So we've got so many battles to face. I mean, there's a worst case scenario, that is, there's no more fringe benefits for clergy. Churches become taxed. I don't think they'll do that, but certainly land tax, to put pressure onto churches to get rid of their land, removing all the other protections, the investments that the ATO makes in churches in one way or another. So yeah, these things the Greens certainly want to remove quite a number of these privileges. And there's also pressure because radical Muslim groups claim those advantages as well, and that will become increasingly obnoxious to people, and so they'll say, look, religion is no good, we'll treat them all the same and just stop it. So yeah, these are very serious issues, and I'm not anxious about it because I know the church will continue, but we could be much better prepared for this than we are. We're sort of naive, and things have moved much more quickly than we have imagined, and the level of hostility is deeper than we realised, and the urgency is necessary too. There's almost a need for an organisation to help churches prep for what's coming down the road, so they're equipped and at least have a chance to hold their ground if they get taken to court. And I think our hierarchy needs to be more across these issues than they are. Another question, yes, Russell.
Mark, with my Missions Interlink hat on,
Yes.
how do you think your book will inform or be a tool for mission agencies? How do you think your book will?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, they're probably flying a bit under the radar with some of these issues. I think they should be paying attention to the broader legal context in which they're working and realise that what's happening to some Christians and churches could happen to them as well. So they should be looking quite carefully at candidates and have clear policies about human sexuality in terms of candidates that they accept and what values they have as organisations. They can't just take that for granted. So I think that's important. I mean, one of the challenges is the state keeps on bringing up compliance processes that we have to, fit in with, which impose these values that are quite alien to us too. So people need to be ready for that. Yeah, good question. By the way, in Australia, if a patient comes to the doctor and the doctor says, "Oh, I'd like to pray for you for healing," is that okay? That doctor could be in a lot of trouble. But I was just speaking to a missionary who was working in Jordan, and she's helping Muslims all the time, and they just love it when you pray for them, when Christians pray for them. She has complete freedom to pray for any patient that comes at all. It's ironic in contexts where Christians are persecuted and where Islam can be very violent, that they have this kind of spiritual freedom that we have lost in our culture today. Yeah. I think Russell, just behind you.
Thank you, Mark. I was just quite keen to get your opinion on, in the book it's quite sobering and I found quite shocking to sort of see that some of the denominations are actually, who are probably not as, well, they're a bit more conservative, haven't stated the doctrine, biblical-based doctrine, are the ones that are declining in terms of numbers. And I just thought that was a bit counterintuitive in some respects, as you mentioned, to sort of try and, being more inclusive. You'd think that would lead, in some respects to growth. I'd be very keen to hear your views on that.
I think it's been known for a long time that more conservative churches, the churches that are declining the most are the least conservative ones. They're the least different from the surrounding culture. Uniting Church is a good example. If what the church has to offer you is just what the culture gives you anyway, why get out of bed on a Sunday morning? Or why pay money to a church that's just doing what you've got anyway? It's no point, It's very sacrificial being a Christian. You have to give your prime time up. You have to pay money to support the work of the church. You're meant to be trying to, follow Christ, and it's costly and sacrificial. Lots is asked of you. And what's the point of all that if all the church is just giving you kind of cultural mumbo-jumbo, So that's been known since the 70s, this pattern. I'm not saying that conservative churches never die. They do decline sometimes. So that's not the thesis. The thesis is that if you compare more liberal ones with more conservative ones, it's the liberal ones overall that are in decline. And it's interesting, the Uniting Church is aging, but the census Uniting Church people are a lot younger. So there are lots of young people who say we're uniting, but they don't go to church. That was really interesting in the stats, that they've lost a whole generation. And I think you can do things that keep people in church, or you can do things that drive them out. One of the really interesting stats I found was that census Anglicans in Sydney Diocese are 5 times more likely to be in church than census Anglicans in Brisbane. And they have about the same number of census Anglicans in the two cities. So whatever's been happening in Sydney for decades has been discipling people and encouraging them to stay in church. And whatever's been happening in Brisbane has had the opposite effect. They've lost 80% of their comparative membership over time. So there are things that churches do that keep people and inform people. And teach the Bible is probably a huge one of them. But yeah, the culture has a lot of trouble understanding this. One way of putting it is, there's a view that church is declining, and some churches are declining. But if the only church that existed in Australia was Australian Christian churches, a Pentecostal denomination, that would be one of the fastest growing religious groups in Australia. It would be the fastest growing, because it's gone from nothing to hundreds of thousands in a century. So parts of Christianity are vibrant and growing in Australia, and others are dying. It's complicated. And so, yeah, and that's one of the reasons is that. One of the things I write about in the book is that uniting churches' original foundations were shaky. They were not strong. Their theological foundation was wrong. They made really bad decisions in the way they set up their denomination. And you can just see the effect of it rolling it was like a death wish, the way the church was set up, because of its disconnection from the scriptures and from the authority of the Bible. Yeah. I said to a uniting theologian, he was reading my chapter on the uniting church, and I said, the basis of union has no ethical commands of God acknowledged in it. There's no concept that God might ask people to do something. And he said, that's exactly right about the uniting church. There's no 10 commandments. It's not about God asking anything of us. And that was just a huge flaw in the foundation of the church. Other comments or questions?
The media is going to come behind you. Andrew Bolt is going to interview you.
Oh, well, he hasn't asked yet.
I
have sent in the book.
It's going to happen. And the other thing is our Victorian state government going to use your book when they do their policies on curriculum and religion in schools?
Well, I hope someone will read the book who's doing policy, but maybe you might need to give it to your local member and say, read this. It's deliberately not too long so that politicians can read it, and busy lawyers as well. But yeah, we'll see. I hope it has an impact. Yeah, but it's a matter of people just accessing it. Yeah. Yes, Kim.
And if you take a church that want to be inclusive, want to get numbers in, be welcoming, is what they should be. But then if something happens, there needs to be this clause to say that where there's a clear stance, and between the clause and perhaps welcoming, there's a conflict. So
yeah, that's the churches should welcome people, whatever they're into or up to, and show them the love of Christ. The rubber hits the road for a church is, to what extent should church discipline apply and in what context? So, for example, you might be very welcome at the church even though you're in a relationship which the church doesn't approve of, whatever it might be. But that probably, if you apply to be a worship leader, the church might say, look, we love you dearly, you're welcome to come, but you're really not able to serve in that way in this church because we have a policy about that. And it's a matter of being really clear with people. These are the expectations of our pastors. For example, if a pastor commits adultery in this church, he or she has committed a code of conduct violation, they'll have to leave. But that doesn't mean that you don't welcome adulterers. Of course you do, you know.
conflict in this though, or not?
There will be conflicts, yeah, there will be. And it's hard to do that because many pastors want to welcome everyone, and we do. But you've got to make some decisions, yeah. I've had to stand people down from band because they were in a relationship that was not compatible with Christian teaching, and it was hard. It's painful, but I didn't lose the people in that case. But yeah, the church. This is another thing I write about in the book is discipline. You can't have a policy without discipline. If you have a policy and no discipline, there's no point in having a policy. So churches need to realise that it's not just a matter of saying you have to sign this document. There needs to be the church needs to be willing to follow up and actually apply that policy, or else it's as if they didn't have it at all. And some churches don't apply policies at all. So that's another problem, and that's not sustainable to not be acting on what you believe. That's hard.
Mark, there are obviously a lot of churches, liberal churches, that are going against what the Bible is saying about this ethic. Was that part of your audience for the book, a message for them as well? And if so, what was your hope and desire for
them,
how they would read the book and what impact that might have?
Well, I'd really like Nikki Gemmell to read the book. You know, someone who said the reason why churches are in trouble is that they're not like the world. I'd like her to read it and think, oh, that's not right. You know, well, I want her to have cognitive dissonance big time, you know, and to wonder, I want her to be puzzled and confused and not to know what to make of this and just find it offensive, so that she can think, what have I got wrong? Or how can I rethink? I mean, one of the challenges of changing people's heart, it's true in evangelism, is to create enough cognitive dissonance that the person has an incentive to deal with the issue at hand. And if you don't do that, they'll just keep tolerating the inconsistencies in their lives. So I hope that for people like that, we'll do that. And I hope that for others who deal with the Nikki Gemmells of the world, that they'll have the confidence to hold their ground. There have been a few voices in Melbourne Diocese who for years have been arguing exactly what Nikki Gemmell is saying. And I think lots of people could have just said, look, this is just wrong what you're saying. It's not true. And I would like to see both those things happening. So those that have those sorts of positions to be challenged, but also others around them to be able to engage with them and say, look, it's really off what you're saying. It's not at all the way things are. Yes. Dear brother? Yeah.
It's on? Oh, there it is. I think it's more just a comment that I'm making or reflecting on is about as pastors often feeling this great tension of, yes, of course, I want to love everybody. I want to show inclusivity. I want to show that you are accepted. You'll be loved here in the name of Jesus. And yet the struggle being that you already feel that the person coming, if living in different sort of lifestyle relationships, that already they're going to be saying, well, you don't really love me until you approve, until you condone where I'm at. And from a distance, I've looked and wondered and wished I could have been there to see it a bit closer, was in the late Tim Keller's church, and just understanding that he seemed to have been able to lead in and walk a line where that was absolutely true, that people were loved and welcomed here. And as I read about it and kept getting that sort of report, was he had a good number of people in his congregation who were struggling with all kinds of things. And they knew that the teaching from the front was orthodox, was going to be what the Bible says. But they also knew that they were loved in that place, and they kept on coming, and it kept growing in this way. They sat in that place beautifully, and I just thought, oh, I long to see more examples of that.
We do need examples and teaching and encouragement. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
I think one important thing is not to bait and switch. So if you say we're welcoming, and you don't tell them that there might be, issues of discipline in the church, and you spring it on them later, they'll feel trapped and deceived. So you should be really clear what your policies are. Stick them up on your website, or at least if someone wants to know, they can find out. And everyone needs to know in the staff. And that way, that's much more loving than not letting people know. When they invest in a church and they begin to make friends and they're finding God, and then you tell them, oh, by the way, you could never lead worship or be on the church council or whatever, then that's cruel. So that's important to think through. What are our responsibilities about being transparent and open with people?
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions, then we'll go to
Thank you.
supper.
talking about bait and switch. They've changed the rules in the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne. That so I've been a warden at my small and struggling church. I lead worship. I manage all the music. I play the flute every week, and I'm probably one of the most active people in the church for a long time. And now the rules have changed. So now they've got a new amended code of conduct that everybody has to sign if you want to have any role in the church at all, any ministry whatsoever, from shaking hands at the front door to playing the flute or anything. And it's a code that I can't sign. So it's got a list now of code of conduct for child safety and well-being, and there's a list of about 30 or 32 unacceptable behaviours. So you must sign to promise that you will not engage in, and it's 6.2y, any conduct to change or suppress a person's or a child's sexual orientation or gender identity. And it cites as the relevant legislation the Victorian State Government's Change or Suppression Conversion Prohibitions Act of 2021. So they've changed the rules, and it's I can't sign it, which if they don't change it back, the bishop's going to have to tell me that I can't have any role in my church at all.
Yeah.
Because basically I'll be up to sit in the naughty corner as a potential child abuser.
That's right.
Because they're accepting the state government's ideology that you must have affirmation, and anything other than affirmation is child abuse.
Yes, if someone comes to you and says, I have unwanted sexual attraction and feelings, it's illegal to pray that those feelings change. In fact, the government's given us instructions about how to pray. You can pray by affirming God's love for them and things like that, but you can't pray like this. It's quite detailed. And I've encountered that too, and I'm working out whether to resign from the Anglican Church. But first I need to write to the bishop and say why this is happening. I noticed in the UK that the Parliament is turning against these laws now. There's a movement in the UK, but we in Victoria came in early with it. So that's an example for me. I'm wondering whether I've still got a permission to officiate, which means I can do a baptism or wedding or celebrate. But I can't sign that code of conduct either. So I'm working out how to deal with that, and which approach to deal with it. I was really sad that the Archbishop in Council approved that, and that's an interesting example.
Well, I had initially thought that it was in there just to cover their legal backsides.
It's not necessary for that.
So that they could throw under the bus anyone who had a complaint made against them, which is also an appalling thing, I think. But having had the Archdeacon of my region phone me and talk to me on the phone for an hour to, try to convince me that gender is fluid and it's not fixed, and you don't have to try. You've got to support our transgender children. I thought, I think they actually believe it. So, and I just can't see how there isn't going to be an inevitable split. It's an appalling situation.
It's not good. It's not good. And just a few sentences here and a few sentences there, and then after a while you find it doesn't work anymore. So it's better to make a stink now. I'm just working out how best to make that stink. Yes, Gordon.
The chair of the Social Responsibilities Committee for the Anglican Diocese. I certainly wasn't consulted on that. And I wrote. They had considerable problems with it, and that it could lead to less counselling about sexual issues and sexual problems, etc., that their position could be made untenable. etc. But it was just ploughed through. In fact, it only, some of the groups only sort of got back from their holidays kind of on the eve of the, it was like 20th of January or something like that. And there was no chance to put in submissions, which used to be the case, but for a long time that hasn't happened on those kinds of issues. And for the churches to get together, those sorts of things, there's a range of things you can do that can actually make an impact. With professional groups. There was a Christian who was, I think he was in charge of the psychiatrist group, and
it was more than 10 years ago. There was a motion at the Anglican Synod to affirm, to attack kind of change or suppression approaches. So there's a bit of history in the Anglican Church. There's been a lobby group for this for some time. So, it's a good example, and people will have to be ready for these things to happen. I would ask sometimes, are we going to need to walk away from our property in future? Because if you can't stay with your church in the Anglican Church, you lose your property, and churches are facing those decisions. So these are the things we need to think through. So when the day comes, you think, oh well, here it goes. This is starting now, but you're not shocked and thinking, oh, I don't know what to do. You need to be ready for it. It's coming for you. And the people that pushed that through without consultation and just before Christmas or whatever, they knew exactly what they were doing. And they know that they want to put the church into as small a box as possible. It's illegal to pray for people certain ways in Victoria, and that's the problem. It's a huge imposition on Christian freedom, and for a church to be endorsing that is amazing to me. I think we're just about done. One more.
As a Christian, how can we define or redefine the principle of Christian marriage, such as one husband, one wife, and one male, one female, for a lifelong time, and from the principle and truth and the perspective of the Bible?
Yes, that's right. And every church and every denomination should have that written in their policy and doctrinal statements somewhere, that that's what their understanding of marriage is. They need that. Our job is to love people. It's to show the love of Christ to people and to welcome and include people. So these aren't battles to turn people away or to reject people, but they're battles to, I think, live in truth and love, to have both together. One of the challenges of our culture is that love has triumphed in many ways. The idea of love has become corrupted, it's gone mad, but truth has become trodden down. And as Christians, we need to hold both of those together really confidently and clearly, and to realise they're not at war with each other, they're actually partners, and we need to find a way of truth and love working together in our way of thinking. Thank you, Pastor Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, and all our guests. It will indeed open up a can of worms. There's so many questions and legal issues that we have to face, especially the child safe and those issues. But as Christians, we must prepare to stand for the word. I think one of the closing chapters of Mark's book is to stand true and faithful. And those churches are the ones that God honors. We live in faith. We live in a faith environment regardless. So we must change our mindset that we're living in Babylon. It's no longer Christendom where we are the upper hand, but that's how God worked through even their different setting, a different paradigm. Okay, let us not go any further tonight. Let's have some tea and coffee. Really put yourself a hand. Let's put a hand to ourselves for caring for this issue enough to come tonight to read this book and to support this meeting. Okay, let's give ourselves a hand. Okay, the informal chatting and all, we can also continue with the tea and coffee that's outside. Thank you once again. Good night.